Crimson Desert Plains. Rosie Mercer had always been warned about men like Jack Coulter, drifters with silver tongues and hands that knew too much. But when he pulled her into a darkened alley, his fingers rough and knowing, she forgot every warning. He smirked, his breath warm against her ear. "You keep looking at me like that, sweetheart," he murmured. "And I might just take it as an invitation." Chapter 1. A shadow across the sun-drenched plains. The sun beat down on the parched earth, turning the endless expanse of the plains into a shimmering mirage. Rosie Mercer squinted, her hand shielding her eyes as she surveyed the horizon. Even after all these years, the vastness of it never failed to both awe and unsettle her. The ranch, her family's legacy for 3 generations, stretched as far as the eye could see, a testament to their resilience and hard work, but also a constant reminder of their isolation. Rosie tugged at the worn leather gloves on her hands, feeling the familiar comfort of their texture. She was a woman of the land, her skin tanned and weathered, her hands calloused but strong. Her hair, once the color of ripe wheat, was now streaked with silver, a testament to the passing years and the hardships she had endured. But her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, still held a spark of defiance, a refusal to be broken by the harsh realities of frontier life. Today, that spark felt dimmer than usual. The letter, tucked away in the pocket of her worn denim skirt, weighed heavily on her heart. It was from her younger sister, Clara, the one who had always been the wild one, the one who had chased dreams beyond the confines of the ranch. Clara was in trouble, caught in the web of some outlaw gang in Dusty Creek, a town known for its lawlessness and the shadows it concealed. Rosie's jaw tightened. Family was everything. Her father, God rest his soul, had drilled that into them from the time they were children. Loyalty, duty, honor, these were the cornerstones of their lives, the values that had sustained them through droughts, cattle rustlers, and the ever-present threat of encroaching modernity. She mounted her horse, a sturdy mare named Bess, with a practiced ease. Bess shifted beneath her, sensing the tension in Rosie's posture. "Easy, girl," Rosie murmured, her voice rough with unshed tears. "We've got a long ride ahead of us." As she rode, the landscape blurred around her, the familiar sights of rolling hills and scattered cacti providing little comfort. Her mind was a whirlwind of memories, of Clara's laughter, her rebellious spirit, and the unspoken fear that had always lurked beneath the surface of their sisterly bond. Rosie had always been the responsible one, the one who stayed behind, who kept the ranch running, who sacrificed her own dreams for the sake of family. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air, still warm, carried the scent of sage and dust, a familiar perfume that usually soothed her soul. But tonight it felt heavy, suffocating. A flicker of movement in the distance caught her eye. A lone rider, silhouetted against the setting sun. Rosie's hand instinctively moved to the rifle strapped to her saddle. She wasn't a woman who frightened easily, but the plains held dangers, both human and animal, and caution was a constant companion. As the rider drew closer, she could make out the details: a tall, lean figure astride a powerful black stallion. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but she could sense the intensity of his gaze, even from this distance. There was something about him, a dangerous aura, that sent a shiver down her spine. He reined in his horse a few yards away, the stallion pawing the ground restlessly. Rosie met his gaze, her own unwavering. "Evening," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. The man tipped his hat slightly, revealing a glimpse of dark eyes and a jawline shadowed by stubble. "Ma'am," he replied, his voice a low drawl that sent another unexpected shiver through her. He had a voice that suggested secrets, a voice that hinted at a life lived on the edge. A voice, she realized with a jolt, that was dangerously close to the one described in Clara's frantic letter. A voice, perhaps, that belonged to a man named Jack Coulter. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze lingering on her face, her hands, the rifle strapped to her saddle. It was a look that assessed, that weighed, that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "Lost, are you?" Rosie asked, trying to break the unsettling silence. A faint smile played on his lips, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Not lost, ma'am. Just exploring." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Rosie knew that this was no ordinary drifter. This was a man who carried trouble with him, a man who lived by his own rules. And yet, despite the danger, despite the warning bells ringing in her head, she found herself drawn to him, captivated by the mystery that shrouded him like a cloak. She thought of Clara, of the desperate plea in her letter. And she knew that this encounter, this chance meeting under a darkening sky, was no accident. It was fate, drawing her into a web of danger and desire, a web from which she might never escape. The sky wept a fiery red, a premonition perhaps, or a promise. Chapter 2. The Devil's Bargain in Dusty Creek. Dusty Creek lived up to its name. The town was a collection of ramshackle buildings huddled together as if for protection against the harsh elements and the even harsher realities of frontier life. The main street, a wide expanse of packed dirt, was lined with saloons, a general store, a blacksmith shop, and a few other establishments of dubious repute. The air was thick with the smells of stale beer, sweat, and something else, something indefinable that spoke of desperation and decay. Rosie rode Bess slowly down the main street, her eyes scanning the faces of the men lounging outside the saloons. They were a rough-looking bunch, their faces hardened by sun and hardship, their eyes wary and distrustful. She felt their gazes on her, assessing her, judging her. A lone woman riding into Dusty Creek was a curiosity, an anomaly, and she knew she was attracting unwanted attention. She had left Jack Coulter at the edge of town, his parting words echoing in her ears. "Be careful, sweetheart. This town chews up and spits out the innocent." The warning had been veiled, his tone almost mocking, but she had seen a flicker of something else in his eyes, a hint of concern that had surprised her. She hadn't asked for his help, hadn't even acknowledged that she knew who he was, but his presence, his very existence, had shifted the balance of power. The Silver Dollar Saloon, the largest and most notorious establishment in town, was her destination. Clara's letter had mentioned it, hinting that it was the center of the outlaw gang's operations. Rosie dismounted in front of the saloon, tying Bess to the hitching post. The sounds of raucous laughter and tinny piano music spilled out onto the street. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the swinging doors and stepped inside. The saloon was dimly lit, the air thick with smoke. A long, scarred bar ran the length of the room, and a few rough-hewn tables were scattered around the floor. The patrons, a mix of cowboys, miners, and drifters, turned to look at her, their conversations dying down. A man detached himself from the bar and approached her, his movements slow and deliberate. He was tall and burly, with a face that had seen its share of brawls. A scar ran across his cheek, pulling his mouth into a permanent sneer. "Well, well," he said, his voice raspy. "What have we here?" A little lost lamb strayed into the wolf's den. Rosie met his gaze unflinchingly. "I'm looking for my sister, Clara Mercer." The man's sneer deepened. "Clara, eh? She's occupied at the moment." "I want to see her," Rosie insisted, her voice firm despite the knot of fear tightening in her stomach. "That ain't gonna happen, lady. Clara's got herself into a bit of a mess. And messes cost money to clean up." Rosie's hand went to the small pouch she carried at her waist, the pouch containing the meager savings she had managed to scrape together. "I'll pay. Just let me see her." The man laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "That ain't gonna be enough, sweetheart. Your sister's debts are substantial." He leaned closer, his breath hot and foul against her ear. "But maybe we can work something out. You're a pretty little thing. I'm sure we can find a way for you to earn your sister's freedom." Rosie's blood ran cold. She had expected trouble, but she hadn't anticipated this blatant threat, this utter disregard for decency. She felt a surge of anger, a fierce protectiveness towards her sister, towards herself. "I'm not for sale," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "And you'll regret laying a hand on me or my sister. The man's eyes narrowed. You got spirit, I'll give you that. But spirit ain't gonna get you far in this town. This is my territory, lady. And I make the rules. Suddenly, a voice cut through the tension, a voice that Rosie recognized instantly. She's with me, Bart. Jack Coulter stood at the entrance to the saloon, his silhouette framed by the fading light. He looked even more dangerous in this setting, his presence radiating a quiet menace that silenced the room. Bart's eyes flickered with surprise, then narrowed with suspicion. Coulter? What the hell are you doing here? Jack strolled towards them, his movements smooth and effortless. He stopped beside Rosie, his presence a shield against Bart's predatory gaze. Just looking out for a friend, he said, his voice deceptively mild. She ain't your friend, Coulter. She's a mercer. And the mercers owe us. Jack's hand rested lightly on Rosie's arm, a gesture that was both protective and possessive. The debt's been paid, Bart. Consider it a personal favor. Bart's face twisted with rage. You got no authority here, Coulter. You're an outsider. Maybe, Jack said, his voice dropping to a whisper. But I'm an outsider with a reputation. And you know what that reputation is, don't you, Bart? The threat hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. Bart hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, gauging the reaction of the other men. He knew Coulter's reputation, knew that he was a man not to be trifled with. Finally, Bart backed down, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Jack's silent challenge. Fine, he snarled. Take her. But tell your little sister she ain't welcome in Dusty Creek anymore. Jack nodded, his gaze never leaving Bart's face. We'll be leaving, he said. And we won't be back. He took Rosie's arm and steered her towards the door, leaving Bart and the silent patrons of the Silver Dollar Saloon behind. Outside, the air felt clean and fresh, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. As they neared Bess, Rosie looked up at the sky. Stars were beginning to pepper the fading light, but a lingering darkness remained, a testament to the bargain she suspected she'd just made. Chapter 3. Echoes of gunfire and broken vows. The ride back to the outskirts of Dusty Creek was silent, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the occasional sigh of the wind. Rosie was acutely aware of Jack Coulter riding beside her, his presence both a comfort and a source of unease. She hadn't asked for his help, hadn't even wanted it, but he had intervened, saving her from a situation that could have easily turned disastrous.
Why?
She asked finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was hoarse, her throat tight with emotion. Jack glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Why what? Why did you help me?
You don't even know me.
He shrugged, a casual gesture that belied the intensity of his gaze. Let's just say I have a soft spot for damsels in distress. Rosie scoffed.
Im no damsel.
He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Maybe not. But you are definitely in distress. They rode in silence for a few more minutes, the tension between them thickening. Rosie's mind was racing, trying to make sense of his actions, his motives. He was an outlaw, a drifter, a man with a dangerous past. And yet, he had shown her a kindness, a protectiveness, that she hadn't expected. Clara, what did she do? Rosie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack hesitated, his gaze shifting to the horizon. She got mixed up with the wrong crowd. Borrowed some money, couldn't pay it back. These things happen. But why didn't she come to me? Rosie's voice was filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. We're family. We're supposed to help each other. Sometimes, family isn't enough, Jack said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Sometimes people make mistakes, get in over their heads. And sometimes, they're too ashamed to ask for help. Rosie knew he was right. Clara had always been proud, independent, unwilling to admit weakness. And Rosie, in her own way, had been just as stubborn, just as unwilling to reach out, to bridge the gap that had grown between them. They reached the spot where they had parted earlier, a small copse of trees, offering a semblance of shelter. Jack dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful. Rosie followed suit, her legs stiff from the long ride. You should head back to your ranch, Jack said, his voice turning serious. "It's not safe for you here." "I can't just leave Clara," Rosie protested. "I need to find her. Make sure she's all right." Jack shook his head.
She's gone, Rosie.
Bart wouldn't have let you go so easily if she was still in town. They've moved her, hidden her somewhere. You won't find her here. Rosie's heart sank. She had known, deep down, that it was a long shot, but she had clung to the hope that she could somehow rescue her sister, bring her home. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice filled with despair. Jack studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense and searching.
"You go home," he said softly.
"You forget about Clara. You forget about Dusty Creek.
You forget about me."
His words were like a punch to the gut. Forget about him? How could she forget about the man who had saved her? The man who had stirred something within her, something she hadn't felt in years. "I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. He took a step closer, his presence filling her senses. "You have to," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's the only way." He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers rough against her skin. It was a fleeting touch, a brief moment of contact, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his, trying to understand the conflicting emotions that swirled within her. Suddenly, the sound of gunfire shattered the stillness of the night. It was close, too close. Jack's hand dropped from her cheek, his body tensing. He scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowed.
"Get down,"
he ordered, pushing her towards the ground. Rosie obeyed instinctively, crouching behind Bess, her heart pounding in her chest. More gunshots rang out, followed by the sound of shouting and the thud of running feet. Jack drew his own gun, a Colt Peacemaker, its silver finish gleaming in the moonlight. He moved with a speed and agility that belied his casual demeanor, his body a coiled spring ready to unleash. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Don't move." And then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Rosie alone with the echoes of gunfire and the terrifying realization that the past and the choices they made long ago under a much younger son were far from buried. The vows whispered, the promises broken, were all coming back, riding on the wind. Chapter 4. The Unforgiving Gaze of a Stranger. The darkness was alive with the sounds of chaos. Rosie stayed crouched behind Bess, her body trembling, her mind racing. The gunfire had stopped, replaced by the shouts of men and the frantic whinnying of horses. She had no idea what was happening, who was fighting whom, but she knew that Jack was in the thick of it, risking his life for reasons she couldn't comprehend. She wanted to run, to escape the danger, but she couldn't leave him. He had helped her, protected her, and she owed him, at the very least, her loyalty. And there was something else, something deeper, a connection that had formed between them, a spark of attraction that defied logic and reason. The sounds of fighting grew closer, and Rosie peeked over Bess's back, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw a group of men, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a nearby campfire. They were rough-looking, their clothes torn and dirty, their weapons drawn. They were arguing, their voices raised in anger. And then she saw him.
Jack.
He was standing in the middle of the group, his gun still in his hand, his body tense and alert. He was facing a man who was clearly the leader, a man with a cruel face and cold, calculating eyes. "You betrayed us, Coulter," the leader snarled.
"You took the money and ran."
Jack's expression was unreadable, his voice calm and steady. "I did what I had to do." "You were supposed to bring the girl back," the leader said, his voice dripping with venom. "You were supposed to deliver her to us." Rosie's blood ran cold. The girl? They were talking about Clara. Jack had been working with them, with the outlaw gang that had taken her sister. He had lied to her, betrayed her. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she struggled to breathe. The man she had started to trust, the man who had stirred something within her, was a monster, a cold-blooded criminal. "The deal's off," Jack said, his voice hardening. "I'm taking the girl and leaving." The leader laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You think you can just walk away, Calder? You're outnumbered, outgunned. You're not going anywhere." Jack's hand tightened on his gun. I'm not afraid of you, Vargas.
And I'm not afraid to die.
Vargas's eyes narrowed. Maybe not. But are you willing to let the girl die? Are you willing to let your friend suffer the consequences of your actions? He gestured towards Rosie, and for the first time, she realized that she had been seen. The men turned to look at her, their eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and malice. She was trapped, exposed, with nowhere to run. Jack's gaze met hers, and she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a mixture of regret and determination. He had put her in danger, and he knew it. Leave her out of this, Vargas, Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. This is between you and me. Vargas smiled, a cruel, triumphant smile. Everything is connected, Coulter.
You should know that by now.
The girl is part of the deal. She's the leverage we need to ensure your cooperation. Rosie's mind was reeling. She was a pawn in their game, a bargaining chip in their twisted power struggle. She had trusted Jack, and he had betrayed her. She had allowed herself to feel something for him, and now she was paying the price. She looked at Jack, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger, hurt, and disappointment. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He had made his choice, and now she had to make hers. She stood up, her legs shaky but firm. She walked towards the group of men, her head held high, her eyes fixed on Jack's. She had to confront him, to demand answers, to understand why he had done this to her. And as she walked, she began to realize that she had to confront the stranger he'd become, a man she no longer recognized, a man who looked at her with an unforgiving gaze that chilled her to the bone. She had to find out what it was she truly saw in the reflection of those dark, haunted eyes. Chapter 5. Secrets Buried Beneath the Desert Moon. The air crackled with tension as Rosie approached the circle of men. The firelight cast dancing shadows on their faces, highlighting the grim lines of their mouths and the glint of steel in their hands. Vargas, the leader, watched her with a predatory smirk, while the others shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between her and Jack. Jack stood motionless, his gun still drawn but lowered slightly. His face was a mask, betraying nothing of his inner thoughts. But Rosie could see the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his hand. He was a cornered animal, ready to strike, but also aware of the precariousness of his situation. So, the little bird walks into the cage, Vargas said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Brave or foolish? I can't quite decide. Rosie ignored him, her gaze fixed on Jack.
Why?
She asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. Why did you lie to me? Jack didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to gauge her intentions. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. I did what I had to do, he said finally, his voice low and rough. To protect who? Yourself? Rosie's voice rose, fueled by a surge of betrayal. You used me. You used my sister. It's more complicated than that, Jack said, his gaze flickering towards Vargas. Complicated? Rosie scoffed. You're an outlaw, a criminal. You work with these animals. Vargas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He's one of us, sweetheart. Always has been. You just didn't know it. Rosie shook her head, refusing to believe it. No, she whispered.
There's good in you. I saw it.
Jack's expression softened for a moment, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the hard mask he had worn all night. The good in me died a long time ago, Rosie, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. You're better off forgetting you ever met me. His words were like a knife twisting in her heart. She had allowed herself to hope, to believe in the possibility of something more, and now she was faced with the harsh reality of his true nature. Tell me about Clara, Rosie demanded, her voice regaining some of its strength. Where is she? Vargas stepped forward, his smile widening. Your sister is safe for now. As long as Coulter cooperates. What do you want from him? Rosie asked, her eyes narrowed. We have unfinished business, Vargas said, his gaze shifting to Jack. A debt that needs to be repaid. Rosie's mind was racing. She had to find a way out of this, a way to save herself and Clara. She couldn't trust Jack, but she couldn't abandon her sister. "Let me go," Rosie said, her voice firm. "Let me go, and I'll forget I ever saw any of this." Vargas laughed. "You think it's that easy? You're a witness, sweetheart. You know too much." "I won't tell anyone," Rosie pleaded.
I swear.
"Your word means nothing," Vargas said, his voice hardening. "You're a Mercer, and the Mercers are our enemies." Rosie's heart sank. She was trapped, caught in a web of old feuds and hidden betrayals. She looked at Jack, her eyes pleading for help, but he remained silent, his expression unreadable. Suddenly, Jack spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "Let her go, Vargas. She's not part of this." Vargas's smile vanished, replaced by a look of fury. "You dare defy me, Coulter? After everything we've done for you? I'm done taking orders from you," Jack said, his hand tightening on his gun. "The girl goes free." The tension in the air thickened, the threat of violence palpable. The men around them shifted nervously, their hands hovering over their weapons. Rosie held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what Jack was planning, but she knew that he was risking everything for her. And in that moment, despite everything, she felt a flicker of hope, a spark of belief in the man he could be, the man he might have been before the desert moon buried all his secrets. The standoff was a testament, a question, and a revelation all wrapped into one. She didn't know what would happen next, only that some buried truth was about to be unearthed. Chapter 6. The Price of Freedom in a Lawless Land. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. Jack and Vargas stared at each other, their bodies tense, their eyes locked in a battle of wills. The other men watched, their hands hovering over their weapons, uncertain of what to do. Rosie held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that a single wrong move, a single spark, could ignite the powder keg of tension that surrounded them. She looked at Jack, her eyes pleading for him to reconsider, to find another way. But his face was set, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with a cold determination that she had never seen before. "You're making a mistake, Coulter," Vargas said, his voice low and menacing. "You can't win this." "Maybe not," Jack replied, his voice equally low. "But I'm not backing down." Vargas's lips curled into a sneer.
"So be it."
"You've chosen your fate." He nodded to his men, and they raised their weapons, aiming them at Jack. Rosie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She wanted to scream, to beg them to stop, but she knew it was useless. Jack didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his gun still pointed at Vargas, his eyes unwavering. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he refused to surrender. Suddenly, a voice cut through the tension, a voice that Rosie recognized. "Hold your fire." Everyone turned to look at the source of the voice. It was Clara, Rosie's sister. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, her hands tied behind her back, her face pale and bruised. But her eyes were filled with a fierce determination, a spark of the rebellious spirit that Rosie knew so well. Vargas's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in anger. "What the hell are you doing here?" he snarled. "Let her go, Vargas," Clara said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Let my sister go, and I'll do whatever you want." Rosie's heart leaped with a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that Clara was alive, fear for what she was offering to do.
"Clara, no."
Rosie cried. "Don't do this." Clara ignored her, her gaze fixed on Vargas.
"You have my word," she said.
"I'll cooperate. Just let her go." Vargas hesitated, his eyes flickering between Clara and Jack. He was clearly weighing his options, calculating the risks and rewards. "You're lying," Vargas said finally, his voice filled with suspicion. "You'll betray us the first chance you get." "I won't," Clara insisted. "I swear on our father's grave." The mention of their father, the weight of their shared history, seemed to have an effect on Vargas. He lowered his gun slightly, his expression softening. "Untie her," he ordered one of his men. The man hesitated, glancing at Jack, who remained motionless, his gun still trained on Vargas.
Do it.
Vargas snapped. The man reluctantly obeyed, cutting the ropes that bound Clara's hands. Clara rubbed her wrists, her eyes meeting Rosie's. There was a silent exchange between them, a mixture of gratitude, relief, and unspoken understanding. Now, get out of here, Vargas said to Rosie, his voice gruff. And take your sister with you. Rosie didn't hesitate. She ran to Clara, embracing her tightly. Are you all right? She whispered. I'm fine, Clara said, her voice trembling slightly.
Just get us out of here.
Rosie nodded, her eyes darting to Jack. He was still standing there, his gun lowered, his expression unreadable. He had saved them, both of them, but at what cost? Thank you, Rosie said to him, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer, didn't even look at her. He just nodded slightly, his gaze fixed on Vargas. Rosie took Clara's hand, and they turned to leave, walking quickly away from the clearing, away from the danger, away from the man who had both saved and betrayed them. The price of their freedom, Rosie knew, was yet to be fully calculated, and she wondered, as they stumbled through the darkness, if Jack Coulter would be the one to pay it. The lawless land demanded its due, and she feared what that might be. Chapter 7. A dance with danger under the starlit sky. The two sisters stumbled through the darkness, their hearts pounding, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They didn't speak, didn't dare to look back, their only focus on putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Vargas's camp. The adrenaline that had fueled their escape began to fade, leaving them weak and trembling. Rosie led the way, her familiarity with the terrain guiding them through the maze of rocks and cacti. Clara followed close behind, her hand gripping Rosie's arm tightly. They moved as silently as possible, their ears straining for any sound that might indicate pursuit. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached a small, secluded canyon, a place where Rosie had often sought refuge as a child. The towering rock walls offered a semblance of protection, and a small spring trickled nearby, providing a source of fresh water. They collapsed near the spring, their bodies aching, their minds reeling. Rosie leaned against a rock, her eyes closed, trying to catch her breath. Clara sat beside her, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I'm sorry, Clara whispered finally, her voice choked with emotion.
I'm so sorry, Rosie.
I messed everything up. Rosie reached out and took her sister's hand, squeezing it tightly. It's all right, Clara. We're safe now. That's all that matters. Clara looked up at her, her eyes filled with tears. No, it's not all right. I got involved with those men, I borrowed money, I put you in danger. Rosie sighed, her heart aching for her sister. We all make mistakes, Clara. It's how we learn from them that matters. But this was different, Clara said, her voice trembling. I was so reckless, so stupid. I thought I could handle it, but I was wrong. Rosie pulled her sister into a hug, holding her close. It's over now, Clara. We'll figure out. We always do. They sat there for a long time, clinging to each other, finding comfort in their shared presence. The moon climbed higher in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the canyon, illuminating the rugged beauty of the landscape. As the initial shock wore off, Rosie's thoughts turned to Jack. She couldn't shake the image of him standing there, facing Vargas and his men, risking his life for them. He had betrayed her, lied to her, but he had also saved them. She didn't understand him, didn't know what to make of his conflicting actions. What about him? Clara asked, her voice breaking the silence. Rosie knew instantly who she was referring to. What about him? She asked, trying to sound indifferent. Jack Coulter, Clara said, her voice low. He helped us. He could have been killed. Rosie didn't answer. She didn't know what to say. She was torn between anger and gratitude, between suspicion and a strange, undeniable attraction. He's not what you think he is, Rosie, Clara said, her eyes searching her sister's face. He's complicated. He's an outlaw, Rosie said, her voice flat. He works with those men. He used to, Clara corrected. But he's trying to get out. He's trying to change. Rosie scoffed. People don't change, Clara. Especially not men like him. He's different, Clara insisted. He has a good heart, buried deep down.
I've seen it.
Rosie looked at her sister, her eyes filled with doubt. She wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that there was some good in Jack, but she couldn't ignore the evidence, the betrayal, the danger he had brought into their lives. The night was filled with a haunting beauty, the stars a silent audience to their whispered confessions. A dance with danger had just concluded, but the music, Rosie knew, was far from over. A different, more subtle rhythm was beginning to play, and she wasn't sure she knew the steps. The vast, starlit sky seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Chapter 8. The Bitter Taste of Betrayal's Kiss. The first rays of dawn painted the canyon walls in hues of pink and gold, chasing away the shadows of the night. Rosie and Clara had slept fitfully, their bodies exhausted, but their minds restless. They awoke to the sounds of birds chirping and the gentle gurgling of the spring. They shared a meager breakfast of dried meat and water, their conversations stilted and awkward. The events of the previous night hung between them like a heavy curtain, casting a shadow over their reunion. Rosie couldn't shake the image of Jack, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, his actions a puzzle she couldn't solve. "We need to get back to the ranch," Rosie said finally, breaking the silence. "It's not safe for us to stay here." Clara nodded, her eyes downcast. "I know. I'm sorry for dragging you into this mess." "It's not your fault, Clara," Rosie said, trying to reassure her. "We'll figure it out, together." They packed their few belongings and prepared to leave the canyon. As they were about to mount their horses, they heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Their hearts leaped into their throats, their bodies tensing with fear. "Hide," Rosie whispered, pulling Clara behind a large boulder. They crouched there, holding their breath, listening as the rider drew closer. The hoofbeats stopped just outside the canyon entrance, and a voice called out, a voice that Rosie recognized instantly. "Rosie? Clara? Are you in there?" It was Jack. Rosie's mind was racing. What was he doing here? Had he come to finish what he had started? Or had he come to help them? She didn't know what to believe, what to trust. Clara looked at her, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "It's him," she whispered. "What do we do?" Rosie hesitated, her hand hovering over the rifle strapped to her saddle. She could shoot him, and the threat he posed, protect herself and her sister. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. Something held her back, a flicker of doubt, a spark of the attraction she had felt for him. "Stay here," she said to Clara, her voice low and urgent. "I'll handle this." She stepped out from behind the boulder, her rifle held loosely at her side, her eyes fixed on Jack. He was sitting on his horse, his hands empty, his expression unreadable. "What do you want?" Rosie asked, her voice cold and guarded. "I came to make sure you were all right," he said, his voice calm and steady. "We're fine," Rosie said, her voice laced with suspicion. "You can leave now." He didn't move. He just sat there, studying her, his gaze intense and searching. "I know you don't trust me," he said finally. "And I don't blame you. But I'm not here to hurt you." "You lied to me," Rosie said, her voice trembling with anger. "You betrayed me." "I did what I had to do to protect you," he said, his voice rising slightly. "To protect both of you. By working with those men?" Rosie scoffed. "By putting us in danger?" "It was the only way," he insisted. "I had to play along, gain their trust, to find out where they were holding Clara." "And then what?" Rosie asked, her eyes narrowed. "Were you going to rescue her? Or deliver her to them?" He hesitated, his gaze flickering away from hers. I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "I was torn. I didn't know what to do." His honesty, his vulnerability, surprised her. She had expected him to lie, to deny, to maintain the facade of the hardened outlaw. But he was showing her a different side of himself, a side that was conflicted, uncertain, and surprisingly human. He dismounted and walked towards her, stopping a few feet away. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. It was a gentle touch, a tender gesture that sent a shiver down her spine. I'm sorry, Rosie, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. I never meant to hurt you. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. She wanted to believe him, wanted to forgive him, but the pain of his betrayal was still raw, the wound still fresh. He leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. It was a kiss of desperation, a plea for understanding, but it tasted of regret, of lost opportunities, and the bitter truth of their intertwined fates. The taste was a stark contrast to the sweetness she had briefly imagined, and it was a taste that would linger. Chapter 9. Scars of the Past, Whispers of the Future. The kiss lingered, a bittersweet echo of what might have been. Rosie pulled away, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. She couldn't deny the attraction she felt for him, the undeniable pull that had drawn them together from the moment they met. But she couldn't ignore the betrayal, the lies, the danger he represented. Don't, she said, her voice trembling.
Don't do that.
Jack stepped back, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and longing. I know I messed up, Rosie, he said, but I'm trying to make things right.
How?
Rosie asked, her voice laced with skepticism. How can you possibly make things right? He hesitated, his gaze shifting to the ground. I can help you, he said finally. I can help you get your sister back on her feet, help you rebuild your lives. We don't need your help, Rosie said, her pride stung. We can manage on our own. Maybe, Jack said, his voice low. But you shouldn't have to. You deserve better. He looked up at her, his eyes pleading for understanding.
I know I'm not the man you thought I was, he said.
But I'm not the man Vargas thinks I am either. I'm somewhere in between, trying to find my way. His words resonated with her, striking a chord deep within her own soul. She, too, was a woman caught between two worlds, between the expectations of her family and the desires of her own heart. She, too, was trying to find her way, to navigate the treacherous path between duty and freedom. Tell me, Rosie said, her voice softening slightly. Tell me about your past. Tell me why you became an outlaw. Jack hesitated, his eyes clouding over with painful memories. He looked out at the vast expanse of the plains, as if searching for the words to express the burden he carried. It's a long story, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. We have time, Rosie said, her voice gentle. He sat down on a nearby rock, his body slumped, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his past. Rosie sat beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body, but far enough to maintain a sense of distance. He began to speak, his voice low and hesitant at first, then gaining strength as he delved deeper into his memories. He spoke of a childhood filled with hardship and loss, of a father who had been a gambler and a drunkard, of a mother who had died too young. He spoke of running away from home at a young age, falling in with the wrong crowd, learning to survive by his wits and his gun. He spoke of the choices he had made, the mistakes he had regretted, the scars he carried, both visible and hidden. He spoke of the loneliness, the emptiness, the constant search for something he couldn't name. As he spoke, Rosie listened, her heart aching for the boy he had been, the man he had become. She saw the pain in his eyes, the vulnerability beneath the hardened exterior. She understood, in a way she hadn't before, the forces that had shaped him, the demons he battled. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. The air was still and quiet, the only sounds Jack's voice and the occasional sigh of the wind. The scars of his past were laid bare, exposed under the harsh light of day. Yet whispers of a possible future began to weave through his story, a fragile thread of hope that Rosie found herself clinging to, despite her better judgment. The future was uncertain, but the present moment, this shared vulnerability, felt like a turning point. Chapter 10. Riding the Storm of Reckoning. The story Jack unfolded was a tapestry woven with threads of hardship, regret, and a desperate yearning for redemption. He spoke of his involvement with Vargas, of the robberies and heists, the violence, and the betrayal. He didn't try to justify his actions, didn't try to paint himself as a hero. He simply laid bare the truth, the ugly and the beautiful, the choices he had made and the consequences he had faced. Rosie listened, her initial anger and resentment slowly giving way to a grudging respect, a flicker of understanding. She saw the man beneath the outlaw, the human being struggling to break free from the chains of his past. "I'm not proud of what I've done," Jack said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "But I can't change it. All I can do is try to make amends, to live a different life." "And what about Clara?" Rosie asked, her voice soft but firm. "What about the debt she owes Vargas?" Jack's jaw tightened. "I'll take care of it," he said. "I'll find a way to pay him back, to get her out of his clutches."
"How?"
Rosie asked, her eyes searching his. "You're an outlaw, Jack. You have no money." He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. "I have connections," he said finally. "People who owe me favors." Rosie knew he was being evasive, that he was hiding something. But she also knew that she couldn't push him too hard, that she had to trust him, at least for now. "We need to get back to the ranch," Rosie said, changing the subject. "We need to figure out what to do next." Jack nodded, his expression grim. "You're right. It's not safe for you to be seen with me." They mounted their horses and rode out of the canyon, leaving behind the sanctuary of its walls and the echoes of Jack's confession. The ride back to the ranch was tense and silent, the unspoken questions and uncertainties hanging heavy between them. As they approached the familiar site of the ranch house, Rosie felt a surge of relief, a sense of homecoming. But she also knew that things would never be the same, that the events of the past few days had changed her relationship with her sister, changed her perception of the world. They rode into the ranch yard, dismounting in front of the house. The ranch hands, who had been working in the fields, stopped what they were doing and stared at them, their eyes filled with curiosity and concern. Rosie's foreman, a grizzled old man named Jed, approached them, his face etched with worry. "Rosie, thank God you're all right. We were worried sick about you." "I'm fine, Jed," Rosie said, forcing a smile. "Just a bit of trouble in town." She didn't mention Jack, didn't want to explain his presence, the complications he brought. She just wanted to get inside, to feel the safety and comfort of her home. But as she turned to enter the house, she saw a figure standing on the porch, a figure that made her blood run cold. It was Vargas. He was leaning against a post, his arms crossed, his face twisted into a cruel smile. Well, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look who's back. And with our runaway bride. No less." Rosie's heart sank. She knew this wasn't a coincidence. Vargas had come for Clara, and he wouldn't leave without her. The storm of reckoning had arrived, and Rosie knew that she and Jack would have to ride it out together, whether they wanted to or not. The peaceful facade of the ranch was shattered, and the confrontation was inevitable. Chapter 11. The weight of silence in a frontier town. The air thickened with tension, the familiar sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill fading into a muffled background hum. Rosie stood frozen, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle she no longer carried. Beside her, Clara gasped, her face paling. Jack, ever vigilant, shifted his stance, his hand hovering near his holstered gun. Vargas pushed himself off the porch post, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring the moment. He strolled towards them, his eyes fixed on Clara, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "I told you, little bird," he said, his voice a silken threat. "You can't escape me." Clara flinched, but she stood her ground, her chin lifted in defiance. "I made a deal," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You let my sister go." Vargas chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Deals are made to be broken, sweetheart. Especially in this lawless land." He turned his gaze to Rosie, his eyes narrowing. "You should have stayed out of it, Mercer. You should have let your sister pay her debts." "She's family," Rosie said, her voice firm despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect her." "Brave words," Vargas said, his smile widening. "But words won't save you now." He gestured towards the ranch hands, who were watching the scene unfold with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Take them," he ordered. "Both of them." The ranch hands hesitated, their loyalty to Rosie warring with their fear of Vargas and his men, who were now emerging from behind the barn, their weapons drawn. Jed, the foreman, stepped forward, his face etched with determination. "You ain't talking nobody, Vargas," he said, his voice low and steady. "This is Mercer land, and we stand by our own." Vargas laughed, a mocking sound that echoed across the yard. "You, and what army, old man?" He nodded to his men, and they moved forward, their guns pointed at the ranch hands. The standoff was imminent, the air thick with the threat of violence. Suddenly, Jack spoke, his voice calm and commanding. "Let them go, Vargas. This is between you and me." Vargas turned his gaze to Jack, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and respect. "You again, Coulter? Always interfering, always playing the hero." "I'm not a hero," Jack said, his voice flat. "I'm just trying to do what's right."
Right?
Vargas scoffed. "There's no right or wrong in this world, Coulter. Only power. And I have it." He raised his hand, signaling his men to attack. But before they could move, a shot rang out, a single, sharp crack that echoed across the yard. Everyone froze, their eyes darting to the source of the shot. It had come from the roof of the ranch house. Standing there, silhouetted against the bright sky, was a figure holding a rifle. It was a figure that no one expected. The figure was slight, almost frail. But it was a figure, a person who carried an enormous, hidden weight. And it was a weight they unloaded at that precise moment. The weight of the silence in this frontier town had been broken by an unlikely savior, and the consequences were about to unfold under the unforgiving gaze of the midday sun. Chapter 12. A haven built on shifting sands. The figure on the roof was Mrs. Abernathy, the Mercers' longtime housekeeper, a woman known more for her apple pies and stern but loving demeanor than for her marksmanship. She held the rifle with surprising steadiness, her frail frame belying a hidden strength. Her face, usually etched with a gentle smile, was now set in a grim mask of determination. Everyone stared at her, stunned into silence. Vargas was the first to recover, his face twisting with rage. "You old hag," he snarled. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Mrs. Abernathy didn't answer. She simply lowered the rifle, aiming it directly at Vargas's chest. Her eyes, usually warm and twinkling, were now cold and hard, filled with a resolve that surprised even Rosie. "Leave them alone, Mr. Vargas," she said, her voice surprisingly strong and steady. "This ranch is under my protection." Vargas hesitated, his eyes flickering between Mrs. Abernathy and his men. He was clearly caught off guard, uncertain of how to react to this unexpected turn of events. "You're bluffing, old woman," he said finally, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "You won't shoot." "Try me," Mrs. Abernathy said, her finger tightening on the trigger. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence broken only by the ragged breathing of the men and the distant caw of a crow. Rosie held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what was happening, couldn't believe that Mrs. Abernathy, of all people, was standing up to Vargas. Jack, ever observant, saw an opportunity in the chaos. He moved swiftly, disarming one of Vargas's men and turning the gun on Vargas himself. "It's over, Vargas," Jack said, his voice cold and hard. "Let them go." Vargas's eyes darted between Jack and Mrs. Abernathy, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and fear. He was trapped, outnumbered, his carefully laid plans unraveling before his eyes. "You won't get away with this, Coulter," he snarled. "I'll make you pay." "Maybe," Jack said, his voice unwavering. "But not today." He nodded to Rosie and Clara, signaling them to move towards the house. They obeyed, their legs shaky but firm, their eyes fixed on Jack. With Jack and Mrs. Abernathy covering them, Rosie, Clara, and the ranch hands retreated into the house, barricading the doors and windows. They were safe for the moment, but they knew that Vargas wouldn't give up easily. Inside the house, the atmosphere was tense and chaotic. The ranch hands were armed and ready, their faces grim with determination. Rosie and Clara tended to Mrs. Abernathy, who was surprisingly calm, her hands steady despite the ordeal. "Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy," Rosie said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You saved us." Mrs. Abernathy smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile. "This ranch is my home, Rosie," she said, "and I'll protect it with my life." Her words resonated with Rosie, reminding her of the strength and resilience of the women in her life, the women who had built and sustained the ranch through generations of hardship. But even as they found a temporary haven within the familiar walls of the ranch house, Rosie knew that it was a haven built on shifting sands. Vargas was still out there, and he wouldn't rest until he had his revenge. The fight was far from over, and the future remained uncertain, a precarious landscape of danger and hope. The uneasy quiet felt more threatening than any outright attack. Chapter 13. The Ghost of Yesterday's Promises. The standoff continued into the late afternoon. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the ranch house into an oven. The air was thick with tension and the smell of sweat and fear. Rosie and the others kept watch at the windows, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Vargas and his men. Jack, restless and on edge, paced the floor, his mind racing. He knew that Vargas wouldn't attack in broad daylight, that he would wait for the cover of darkness. He also knew that they were outnumbered and outgunned, that their chances of survival were slim. He looked at Rosie, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. He felt a surge of protectiveness towards her, a fierce desire to keep her safe. He had brought this danger upon her, and he would do whatever it took to get her out of it. "We need a plan," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to attack." Rosie nodded, her gaze meeting his.
"I know.
But what can we do?" "We need to escape," Jack said. "We need to get out of here before nightfall." "Where would we go?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "Vargas has men everywhere. There's an old abandoned mine shaft about 5 miles north of here," Jack said. "We could hide there until things blow over." "It's risky," Jed said, his voice skeptical. "If Vargas finds us there, we'll be trapped." "It's our best chance," Jack insisted. "We can't stay here and wait for them to pick us off one by one." Rosie hesitated, her mind weighing the risks and rewards. She trusted Jack's instincts, his knowledge of the terrain, and the outlaw mentality. But she also knew that he was a wanted man, that his presence put them all in danger. "All right," she said finally. "We'll do it. But we need to be careful." They spent the next hour preparing for their escape. They gathered supplies, ammunition, and water, packing them into saddlebags. They chose the strongest horses, the ones that could handle the rough terrain. As they were preparing to leave, Mrs. Abernathy approached Rosie, her eyes filled with concern. "Be careful, child," she said, her voice soft.
"And watch out for that man."
Rosie knew she was referring to Jack. She nodded, her heart heavy with unspoken emotions.
"I will," she said.
"Thank you for everything, Mrs. Abernathy." "Your family, Rosie," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice firm. "And we protect our own." They left the ranch house under the cover of the late afternoon shadows, moving quickly and quietly, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Jack led the way, his senses alert, his body tense, and ready for action. As they rode, Rosie's mind drifted back to Jack's story, to the revelations he had shared in the canyon. She thought about his difficult childhood, his lost innocence, his desperate search for belonging. She saw the ghost of yesterday's promises in his eyes, the flicker of the man he might have been, the man he was still struggling to become. She knew that his past was a part of him, a shadow that would always follow him. But she also saw a glimmer of hope, a possibility of redemption. And that glimmer, faint as it was enough to keep her riding beside him, into the uncertain darkness that lay ahead. A sliver of moon appeared in the sky, mirroring the fragile hope in her heart. Chapter 14. Flames of Desire in the Cold Night. The journey to the abandoned mine shaft was fraught with tension. They rode in silence, their ears straining for any sound that might betray their presence. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, the rocky terrain testing the endurance of both horses and riders. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted, the desert air turning cold and biting. They huddled together for warmth, their bodies pressed close, their breaths mingling in the frigid air. Rosie found herself drawn to Jack, his presence a source of comfort and strength in the face of danger. They reached the mine shaft just as the moon reached its zenith, casting an eerie glow over the desolate landscape. The entrance to the mine was hidden behind a cluster of rocks, a dark and forbidding opening that seemed to swallow the light. Jack dismounted, his movements cautious and deliberate. He checked the area for any signs of recent activity, his senses alert for any hint of danger. "It looks clear," he said finally, his voice low. "But we need to be careful. This place could be unstable." They led the horses inside the mine, the darkness enveloping them like a shroud. The air was damp and musty, the silence broken only by the dripping of water and the occasional scuttling of unseen creatures. They found a relatively dry chamber a short distance from the entrance, a small, enclosed space that offered a semblance of protection. They unpacked their supplies and built a small fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The fire provided warmth and light, but it also cast a spotlight on their vulnerability. They were trapped, hidden, their fate uncertain. Rosie sat beside Jack, her body close to his, seeking warmth and reassurance. She looked at him, his face illuminated by the firelight, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "Are you afraid?" she asked, her voice soft. He hesitated, his gaze shifting to the flames. "Of course," he admitted. "But I'm more afraid of failing you, of letting you down." His honesty touched her, his vulnerability disarming. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "You haven't let me down, Jack," she said. "You saved us. You're still saving us." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was both a plea and a promise. This time, there was no bitterness, no regret, only a raw, undeniable connection. The kiss deepened, fueled by the shared danger, the adrenaline, the unspoken emotions that had been simmering between them. It was a kiss of desperation, of longing, of a desire that transcended the fear and the uncertainty. It ignited a spark. Rosie responded with equal fervor, her body molding against his, her heart pounding in her chest. She forgot the danger, the outlaw, the past. She only felt the present moment, the warmth of his embrace, the fire that burned between them. They clung to each other, their bodies intertwined, their souls connected. The flames of desire consumed them, melting away the coldness of the night, the darkness of the mine. In that small, enclosed space, surrounded by danger and uncertainty, they found a moment of solace, a spark of hope, a promise of something more. The cold night air, the dampness of the mine, all faded away, replaced by the heat of their passion. Chapter 15. Unmasking the Heart of an Outlaw. The fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls of the mine shaft. Rosie and Jack lay wrapped in each other's arms, their bodies still tingling from the intensity of their embrace. The silence was broken only by the gentle crackling of the embers and the soft rhythm of their breathing. Rosie traced the lines of Jack's face with her fingertips, her touch gentle and curious. She saw the scars, both visible and hidden, the marks of a life lived on the edge. But she also saw the vulnerability, the tenderness, the longing for something more than the life he had known. "Tell me about her," Rosie said softly, her voice breaking the silence. Jack knew instantly who she was referring to. He had mentioned a woman, a fleeting reference during his confession in the canyon, a woman who had played a significant role in his past. He hesitated, his eyes clouding over with painful memories. He had tried to bury that part of his life, to forget the woman who had both loved and betrayed him. But Rosie's question, her gentle insistence, forced him to confront the ghost that still haunted him. "Her name was Sarah," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "She was everything to me." He spoke of a woman who had been his childhood sweetheart, his partner in crime, his confidant. He spoke of their dreams, their plans, their shared desire to escape the harsh realities of their lives. "We were going to leave," he said, his voice filled with regret. "We were going to start a new life, somewhere far away from the violence and the betrayal." But their dreams had been shattered, their plans derailed by a betrayal that had left Jack broken and embittered. Sarah had betrayed him, siding with his enemies, choosing money and power over love and loyalty. "She sold me out," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "She took the money and ran, leaving me to face the consequences." The pain of that betrayal was still raw, the wound still fresh, even after all these years. It had hardened him, made him distrustful, made him wary of love and commitment. Rosie listened, her heart aching for the young man he had been, the dreams he had lost, the love that had turned to ashes. She understood, in a way she hadn't before, the source of his cynicism, his reluctance to trust, his fear of vulnerability. "I'm sorry, Jack," she said softly, her voice filled with compassion. "I'm so sorry for what you've been through." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the sincerity in her gaze, the genuine empathy that radiated from her. He felt a flicker of warmth, a spark of hope, a possibility of healing. He leaned in and kissed her again, a slow, tender kiss that was different from the passionate embrace they had shared earlier. This kiss was a promise, a commitment, a tentative step towards a future that might be different from the past. It was a kiss to unmask the heart of a man who had lived as an outlaw. It was a kiss with no conditions, a kiss without the ghost. Chapter 16. The Long Road to Redemption's Dawn. The night passed slowly, punctuated by moments of shared intimacy and uneasy silences. Rosie and Jack talked, sharing their hopes and fears, their dreams and regrets. They explored the fragile connection that had formed between them, a bond forged in danger and strengthened by vulnerability. As dawn approached, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were still trapped, still hunted, their future uncertain. They knew they couldn't stay in the mine shaft forever, that they had to find a way to escape, to resolve the conflict with Vargas. "We need to get word to the sheriff," Rosie said, her voice firm. "We need to tell him what Vargas is doing about Clara's kidnapping." Jack hesitated, his expression troubled. "The sheriff in Dusty Creek is corrupt," he said. "He's in Vargas's pocket. We can't trust him." "Then we'll go to the next town," Rosie insisted. "We'll find someone who will listen, someone who will help us." Jack nodded, his mind racing, trying to formulate a plan. He knew the risks, the dangers, but he also knew that he couldn't abandon Rosie and Clara, that he had to see this through to the end. "There's a small town called Redemption about 2 days' ride from here," he said finally. "The sheriff there is an honest man, a former Texas Ranger. He might be willing to help us." "Then that's where we'll go," Rosie said, her voice filled with determination. "We'll ride at first light." They spent the remaining hours of darkness preparing for their journey. They packed their supplies, checked their weapons, and rested as much as possible. They knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous, that they would face many challenges. As the first rays of dawn pierced the darkness of the mine shaft, they emerged from their hiding place, their faces grim but resolute. They mounted their horses and rode out into the vast expanse of the plains, leaving behind the temporary sanctuary of the mine and heading towards an uncertain future. The ride to redemption was grueling, the terrain harsh and unforgiving. They rode through canyons and across deserts, under the scorching sun and the cold night sky. They rationed their food and water, conserving their energy for the challenges that lay ahead. Along the way, they talked, sharing their stories, their hopes, their fears. Rosie learned more about Jack's past, about the events that had shaped him, the choices he had made. She saw the good in him, the potential for redemption, the yearning for a different life. And Jack saw the strength and resilience in Rosie, the unwavering loyalty to her family, the fierce determination to protect those she loved. He saw the woman he could be with, the woman who could help him heal, the woman who could show him a different path. The long road to redemption was not just a physical journey, it was a journey of the heart, a journey of transformation, a journey towards a dawn that might finally bring peace and forgiveness. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but they rode on, their hopes a fragile beacon in the vast wilderness. Chapter 17. Crossroads of Fate and Forgiveness. 2 days of hard riding brought them to the outskirts of redemption. The town, nestled in a small valley, was a welcome sight after the harsh and desolate landscape they had traversed. It was a small, unassuming place, with a single main street lined with wooden buildings, a church, a general store, and a sheriff's office. As they rode into town, they drew curious glances from the townsfolk. A woman and a man, dusty and weary, riding alongside each other, their horses bearing the marks of a long journey, were a sight that piqued interest and speculation. They dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, their bodies stiff and sore from the long ride. Jack scanned the street, his senses alert for any sign of danger. He knew that Vargas might have sent men ahead, that they could be walking into a trap. "Stay close," he said to Rosie, his voice low and urgent. "And be ready for anything." Rosie nodded, her hand resting on the rifle strapped to her saddle. She was afraid, but she was also determined. She had come this far, and she wouldn't back down now. They entered the sheriff's office, a small, sparsely furnished room with a desk, a few chairs, and a gun rack on the wall. A man in a sheriff's uniform sat behind the desk, his face weathered and lined, his eyes sharp and intelligent. He looked up as they entered, his gaze assessing them carefully. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. "We need your help, Sheriff," Rosie said, stepping forward. "We've been through a lot." She explained their situation, telling him about Vargas, about Clara's kidnapping, about the corrupt sheriff in Dusty Creek. She spoke with passion and conviction, her voice trembling with emotion. The sheriff listened patiently, his expression unchanging. When she had finished, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Jack. "You're Jack Coulter, aren't you?" he said, his voice low. Jack hesitated, his hand instinctively moving towards his gun. "That's right," he said, his voice guarded. "I've heard of you," the sheriff said. "You have a reputation." "Reputations can be misleading," Jack said, his voice flat. The sheriff nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe," he said. "But I also know that you helped this woman and her sister. That counts for something." He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked towards them, stopping a few feet away. "I believe you," he said, his voice firm. "And I'll help you. But I need your word that you'll cooperate with me, that you'll follow my orders." Jack looked at Rosie, his eyes searching hers. He saw the trust in her gaze, the belief in him. He nodded. "You have my word, Sheriff," he said. The sheriff smiled, a rare and genuine smile that transformed his weathered face.
"Good," he said.
"Then let's get to work. We have a lot to do." The sheriff, whose name was Thompson, proved to be a man of his word. He listened to their story, gathered evidence, and prepared a plan to confront Vargas and rescue Clara. Rosie and Jack found themselves at a crossroads of fate and forgiveness. They had reached a turning point, a moment where they could choose to continue down the path of violence and retribution, or to embrace a different future, a future built on trust, cooperation, and the possibility of redemption. The choice was theirs, and the weight of that choice rested heavily on their shoulders. But the choice was presented. Chapter 18. Where Loyalty and Love Collide. Sheriff Thompson's plan was bold and risky, but it was their best chance to rescue Clara and bring Vargas to justice. It involved a coordinated raid on Vargas's hideout, a fortified ranch located several miles outside of Dusty Creek. Thompson would lead a posse of his deputies, along with Rosie and Jack, to confront Vargas and his men. The days leading up to the raid were filled with tension and anticipation. Rosie and Jack worked closely with Thompson and his deputies, preparing for the confrontation. They practiced their shooting, honed their strategy, and steeled their nerves for the battle that lay ahead. During this time, Rosie and Jack's relationship deepened, their bond strengthened by the shared danger and the common goal. They found solace in each other's presence, drawing strength from their connection. They spoke of the future, of the possibility of a life together, a life free from the shadows of the past. But the specter of Jack's past, his former association with Vargas, continued to haunt them. Rosie struggled with her doubts, her fears, her lingering questions about his true loyalties. She knew that he was trying to change, that he was genuinely committed to helping her, but she couldn't completely shake the feeling that she was placing her trust in a man who could still betray her. One evening, as they sat by a campfire outside of Redemption, Rosie confronted Jack, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and hurt.
"Why, Jack?" she asked. "Why did you ever get involved with those men? Why did you choose that life?"
Jack looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I told you," he said, his voice low. "It was a mistake, a series of bad choices. I was young, foolish, desperate. But you hurt people," Rosie said, her voice trembling. "You took things that weren't yours. You lived a life of violence." "I know," Jack said, his voice heavy with guilt. "And I'm not proud of it. But I can't change the past. All I can do is try to make amends, to live a different life now."
"Can you?"
Rosie asked, her eyes searching his.
"Can you really change?"
Jack reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "I'm trying, Rosie," he said. "I'm trying for you, for us, for the chance of a future together." His words, his sincerity, touched her heart. She saw the genuine desire for redemption in his eyes, the yearning for a different path. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be challenges and setbacks, but she also knew that she couldn't abandon him, that she had to give him a chance. "I believe in you, Jack," she said, her voice soft but firm.
"But you have to prove it to me."
"You have to prove it to yourself." He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I will," he said. "I swear it." The night before the raid, tensions were high. Loyalty and love collided in Rosie's heart, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She knew that the next day would be a test, not only of their courage and skill, but also of their trust and their commitment to each other. The outcome was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Their lives would be forever changed by the choices they made at the break of dawn. Chapter 19. The Final Stand at Broken Ridge. The dawn broke cold and clear, the sky a vast expanse of pale blue. The air was still and silent, the only sound the chirping of birds and the distant rumble of thunder, a premonition of the storm that was about to break. Rosie, Jack, Sheriff Thompson, and his deputies rode out of Redemption, their faces grim and determined. They were a small but resolute force, riding towards a confrontation that would determine their fate and the fate of Clara. They reached Vargas's hideout, a sprawling ranch nestled in a valley surrounded by rocky hills, just as the sun began to climb above the horizon. The ranch was heavily fortified, with armed guards patrolling the perimeter and a lookout tower overlooking the approach. Thompson's plan was simple but effective. He would lead a frontal assault, drawing the attention of Vargas's men, while Jack and Rosie, along with two of Thompson's most trusted deputies, would circle around to the back of the ranch and infiltrate the main house, where they believed Clara was being held. The battle began with a volley of gunfire, the sharp crack of rifles echoing across the valley. Thompson and his deputies engaged Vargas's men in a fierce firefight, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and the cries of the wounded. Jack and Rosie, along with the two deputies, rode hard and fast, circling around the back of the ranch, using the cover of the hills to conceal their approach. They reached the main house undetected, dismounting and silently approaching the back entrance. They found the door unlocked, a sign that Vargas was confident in his defenses. They slipped inside, their weapons drawn, their senses alert. The house was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and sweat. They moved through the house, room by room, their hearts pounding in their chests. They found several of Vargas's men sleeping off the effects of the previous night's revelry, disarming them without a sound. Finally, they reached a locked door at the end of a long hallway. They could hear muffled sounds coming from inside, the sound of a woman's voice, pleading and desperate. Jack nodded to Rosie, his eyes filled with determination. He kicked the door open, his gun raised, ready to fire. Inside the room, They found Clara tied to a chair, her face bruised and battered, her eyes filled with fear. Standing over her was Vargas, a cruel smile on his face, a gun pointed at her head. Well, Vargas said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look who finally decided to show up. I was beginning to think you'd abandoned your little sister, Coulter. Jack ignored him, his gaze fixed on Clara. Are you all right? He asked, his voice low and urgent. Clara nodded, her eyes filled with tears of relief. I'm fine, she whispered.
Just get me out of here. Not so fast, Vargas said, his smile widening.
You're not going anywhere, Coulter. You and your little girlfriend are going to pay for interfering in my business. He raised his gun, aiming it at Jack. But before he could fire, Rosie stepped forward, her rifle leveled at Vargas's chest. Drop the gun, Vargas, she said, her voice cold and steady. It's over. Vargas hesitated, his eyes flickering between Rosie and Jack. He was outnumbered, outgunned, his carefully laid plan shattered. You won't shoot, sweetheart, he said, his voice losing its confidence. You don't have the guts. Rosie met his gaze. Try me. The final stand at Broken Ridge had reached its climax. The air was thick with the stench of spent gunpowder and the heavy silence of a life or death moment. The fate of everyone present hung precariously in the balance, suspended between a trigger pull and a whispered prayer. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The standoff stretched, seconds feeling like an eternity. Vargas's eyes darted between Rosie, unwavering and resolute, and Jack, his expression a mask of grim determination. The two deputies had their weapons trained on Vargas as well, creating a deadly crossfire. Clara, still tied to the chair, watched the scene unfold, her breath caught in her throat. Vargas's bravado began to crumble. He saw the steel in Rosie's eyes, the unwavering commitment in her stance. He knew she wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger. He had underestimated her, underestimated the bond between the sisters, underestimated the power of love and loyalty. Slowly, his hand began to tremble. The gun, once a symbol of his power, now felt heavy and useless. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his eyes flickering with a flicker of fear. All right, he said, his voice hoarse and defeated. All right, you win. I'll drop the gun. He lowered his weapon, letting it fall to the floor with a clatter. The sound echoed through the room, breaking the tension like a thunderclap. Jack moved swiftly, kicking the gun away from Vargas and pressing his own weapon against Vargas's temple. It's over, Vargas, he said, his voice cold and hard. You're finished. Rosie rushed to Clara, untying her bonds, her hands trembling with relief. The sisters embraced, clinging to each other, tears streaming down their faces. The two deputies secured Vargas, binding his hands and feet. The battle was over. The long and arduous journey had reached its end. Sheriff Thompson and his remaining deputies arrived shortly after, having defeated Vargas's men in the fierce firefight outside. They took Vargas and his surviving henchmen into custody, hauling them away to face justice. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Rosie, Jack, and Clara stood outside the ranch house, watching as the posse rode away, taking Vargas with them. The air was still and quiet, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Rosie turned to Jack, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and relief. Thank you, she said, her voice soft. You saved us. You saved Clara. Jack smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. We saved each other, Rosie, he said. We did it together. Clara stepped forward, embracing Jack, her voice filled with emotion. Thank you, Jack, she said. For everything. Jack hugged her back, his eyes meeting Rosie's over Clara's shoulder. He saw the love and trust in her gaze, the acceptance that had been so long in coming. As the last rays of sunlight faded, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they stood there, the three of them, their hearts filled with a sense of peace and closure. The long and winding road had led them to this moment, to this final confrontation of hearts and horizons. They had faced their demons, conquered their fears, and emerged victorious. The future remained uncertain, but they knew that they could face it together. Their bond forged in the crucible of adversity, their love a beacon of hope in the vast and unforgiving landscape of the frontier. The horizon promised a new dawn, a new beginning, a new chapter in their lives. Epilogue. The years that followed were not without their challenges. The scars of the past, both physical and emotional, lingered, reminders of the battles they had fought and the losses they had endured. But they faced those challenges together, their love and loyalty a constant source of strength and resilience. Jack kept his word. He turned his back on his former life, embracing a new path, a path of honesty and hard work. He worked alongside Rosie on the ranch, learning the ways of the land, becoming a part of the community. He earned the respect of the ranch hands, the trust of the townsfolk, and the love of Rosie and her family. Clara, freed from the clutches of Vargas and the burden of her debts, also found a new beginning. She worked on the ranch, helping Rosie and Jack, finding solace in the familiar rhythms of the land and the unwavering support of her sister. She healed, slowly but surely, the wounds of the past fading into distant memories. Rosie and Jack built a life together, a life filled with love, laughter, and the quiet joys of a simple existence. They raised a family, their children growing up strong and free, surrounded by the vast and beautiful landscape of the frontier. They expanded the ranch, their hard work and dedication paying off, their legacy secured for future generations. Mrs. Abernathy continued to be a part of their lives, her presence a constant reminder of the strength and resilience of the women who had shaped the frontier. She baked her famous apple pies, watched over the children, and offered her wisdom and guidance, her love a constant source of comfort and support. The town of Redemption prospered, becoming a haven for those seeking a new beginning, a place where justice and fairness prevailed. Sheriff Thompson remained a steadfast guardian of the law, his integrity and courage an inspiration to all. And as the years turned into decades, Rosie and Jack would often sit on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant colors, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with gratitude. They had found their redemption, their peace, their forever, in the heart of the wild and unforgiving frontier. They had built a life, a love, a legacy that would endure, a testament to the power of forgiveness, the strength of loyalty, and the enduring promise of a new dawn. The horizon, once a symbol of uncertainty, now stretched before them, filled with the golden light of a well-earned and deeply cherished future. They had ridden through the storm and found their calm harbor, together.